Hi folks, welcome to this video on plyometrics, okay? This has been an essay question in the past, so there's quite a few things that we can say about it. You know, we're trying to make about 7 or 8 points on it, so let's look at what we can say about plyometrics training. Well, firstly, what can we say about it? Plyometrics is about power development, okay? And with it being about power development, it creates hypertrophy of type 2B muscle fibres, okay? So the only athletes who are going to do plyometrics training are power-based performers, throwers, jumpers, sprinters. But if there's a large power-based element to your sport, such as rugby or football, plyometrics training is going to be very, very important to you. What else can we say? We can say what type of activities you do. What constitutes plyometrics training? Well, it's jumping, hopping, bounding work. It's medicine ball work, so clap push-ups, doing sit-ups with medicine balls. You know what this guy is doing in this picture here is classic. Jumping as high as you can and landing. Okay, so jumping, hopping, bounding exercises, they're the things that make up plyometrics training. They're the things that are going to develop power. Now, with it being hopping, jumping, bounding, things like that, clap push-ups, what else can we say? Well, it's an eccentric contraction immediately followed by a concentric contraction. You look at this guy here, okay, as he squats low, as he lands, he's going to get an eccentric contraction on his quadriceps as he lowers himself down into the ground. What he then does is, he does a very strong concentric contraction in the quads to get up as high as he can. And as soon as he lands again, he creates another eccentric contraction, which he will then turn into a concentric contraction on takeoff. So it's an eccentric contraction followed by a concentric contraction. And because you're doing repeated jumps or repeated hops or repeated bounds, so you're doing eccentric on landing, concentric on taking off, eccentric on landing, concentric on taking off, we call it a stretch shortening cycle. Now, it was my issue with it when I was learning it for the first time. Is an eccentric contraction technically a stretch? Well, no, it's not. But the point is the muscle is lengthening during an eccentric contraction as it does with a stretch. So when you land, you get an eccentric contraction, and then where the muscle lengthens or, in inverted commas, stretches. And then when you take off, you produce a concentric contraction where the muscle then shortens. And because you repeat that action over and over again, it's called a stretch shortening cycle. So that's how it works. What we need to now do is understand the science behind it. How does this type of training, because it's quite simple, we don't need any specialist equipment really. How does this type of training develop power? Well, it comes down to this special little structure here called a muscle spindle apparatus, or just basically a muscle spindle. As you can see, these are all myofibrils, these are muscle fibres. Each of these little bands represents the beginning and end of a sarcomere. As you know, the sarcomeres are very, very small. So this muscle spindle, although it looks quite big, they're actually quite small structures, okay? So, muscle spindles exist in our muscle, throughout all of our skeletal muscles. So what does a muscle spindle do? Well, its job is one job, but it does two important things. Its job is to detect stretch and as a result prevent overstretch or injuries associated with overstretch. Now, remember what I've just said. Even though an eccentric contraction is not a stretch, technically the muscle is still getting longer. So if we go back to this guy, the picture of this guy above here, he's coming down from a great height, okay? As you can see, his legs, I know it's a bit of a shadowy picture, but he's extended his knees as he comes into land, okay? But as he then lands, his knees flex. But remember, because he's going down to the ground, this is an eccentric contraction. So the quadriceps are eccentrically contracting. So they are getting longer. They're being stretched over his knee as he flexes. That is going to activate the muscle spindles inside of his quadriceps. Okay? They are going to detect this lengthening of the muscle. And in order to prevent overstretch, they're going to do an important thing. What the muscle spindle then does via these neurons, these nerves, it sends an impulse to the cerebellum. Now remember, the cerebellum is the part of the brain that controls movement, muscle movements, muscle contractions. So when this muscle spindle has got stretched, when we've landed very quickly and the quadriceps has got stretched, it's detected that stretch, and in order to prevent overstretch, it has sent a very quick impulse to the cerebellum in the brain saying, get us out of this. We have landed very, very quickly. We've stretched very, very quickly. We are at the risk of overstretching. and suffering an injury, and the cerebellum then in response creates a concentric contraction, which then allows you to take off again. So it's eccentric contraction followed by a concentric contraction. What happens in between? The muscle spindle is stretched or detects stretch, and in order to prevent the overstretch, it sends an impulse to the cerebellum to create that concentric contraction very quickly and very powerfully to get you out of it. So what does plyometrics training do? It takes advantage of this system that we've got built into our bodies and allows us to produce very quick, fast, explosive movements. And it takes advantage of what we call a stretch reflex, okay? So in other words, when the muscle is stretched very, very quickly or lengthens very, very quickly, we have a natural reflex, a natural instinct to get us out. So when you drop your body suddenly, there is a natural reflex to then push up the other way. And that's the drop is the eccentric contraction, and the concentric contraction is the pushing upwards, outwards, and that's what's called our stretch reflex. So if a question were to come up on this on the exam and it were to be an essay question, we've got to make 8 points. So what are we getting marks for? Well, we are going to get a mark to say that it's about power development, as long as it doesn't say that in the question. We're going to get a mark to say that this is about type 2B muscle fibres and it's about hypertrophy. You're not going to get a mark for each, okay? But you're going to get a mark for saying that it's all to do with these types of activities: jumping, hopping, bounding, medicine ball work, etc., etc. So it's 1 for 1 at this moment in time. However, what has been awarded in the past, you've got 1 mark for saying it's an eccentric contraction, and you've got a second mark for saying that that's immediately followed with a concentric contraction. Okay? You'll also get a mark for acknowledging that you know that this is what's called a stretch shortening cycle. Okay? Then, straight away, if this was an essay question, you know you've got to make 8 points. By mentioning those, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we haven't got onto the really difficult stuff of muscle spindles and cerebellums and things like that. But it's easy enough, it's dead straightforward. What does a muscle spindle do? It detects stretch. That's been awarded as a mark in the past. And preventing overstretch has also been awarded as a separate mark. Now, remember what I've said this in other videos, I've said this in lessons. What you've got to do is hope for the best but expect the worst. What you've got to do is hope that you would get 2 marks for saying those things, but expect to maybe only get 1, and that's going to naturally encourage you to try and make more points. But that's not a bad thing. That's just guaranteeing that you're going to get good marks at the end of it. You're going to get a mark for saying that there is an impulse then sent to the cerebellum from the muscle spindle via these neurons saying, we've stretched, we're potentially overstretched, get us out of it, and therefore you produce a concentric contraction, and you'll get a mark for saying that this is what's known as a stretch reflex, okay? So if you want top marks on plyometrics, that's what you've got to do. It could come up as a half an essay, but you could easily come up as a 3 or a 4 marker, but very specifically saying, explain how plyometrics uses the muscle spindle to develop power. And if that was to come up, you'd be looking at mentioning these things here, okay? You'd probably also get the marks for talking about eccentric and concentric contractions. You probably wouldn't get the marks for saying these, but it's worth putting down just to be on the safe side. Okay, I hope this video has been of use to you. Good luck, folks.